For most of a school year in the late 1970s, a 22-year-old Rolling Stone writer talked his way back into a San Diego high school under a fake identity, and nobody outside the principal's office knew it. What he overheard in that lunch court became a novel, and the novel became one of the most quietly influential teen comedies ever made. Behind the mall jobs, the surfboard, and that bathroom fantasy sits a production a studio executive tried to bury, a director who fought for her own soundtrack, and a cast of future legends nobody had heard of yet. This is Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the film almost nobody wanted, and the one everyone since has copied. Number 1. The writer who faked being a teenager. For most of a school year in the late 1970s, the halls of Claremont High in San Diego held a secret almost nobody on campus suspected. One of the people showing up to class every day was 22 years old and already on staff at Rolling Stone. His name was Cameron Crowe, and he had talked his way back into a real high school under a made-up identity to find out how teenagers actually lived. The cover was never airtight, the principal knew. Several teachers were in on it too, which meant Crowe spent less time grinding through the full student experience and more time parked in the lunch court, listening, taking mental notes on the dramas playing out around him. What he gathered there became a book, and the book became the spine of everything that followed. Universal optioned it before it had even been published, betting on a story that at that point lived only in Crowe's notebooks. That detail matters, because the comedy people remember as broad and silly was built on something close to reportage. The names changed and the school became the fictional Ridgemont, but the texture came straight from a year of a grown man pretending to belong and writing down what he heard. Universal had bought all of it on spec. The harder question was who could turn a reporter's notebook into a movie, and the studio's first answer would have made for a very different film entirely. Number 2. David Lynch almost directed it. Universal's first choice to direct a raunchy high school comedy was a filmmaker who would soon become a byword for nightmarish, slow-burn weirdness. Lynch had just made his name with unsettling, dreamlike work, about as far from a Sunny Mall comedy as a director could get, which is part of what makes the pairing so hard to picture. He sat down with Crowe to talk about the job, then passed politely, saying it wasn't his kind of thing, and drove off in a white Volkswagen Beetle. By then, he had the kind of art house reputation that made studios both curious and wary, which is the only reason a project about stoners and pizza jobs ever landed on his desk in the first place. It's one of the great what-ifs in teen movie history. A version of those Mr. Hand classroom scenes run through the mind that made Eraserhead is almost impossible to imagine. The studio, meanwhile, was left where it started, hunting for someone, anyone, who could make this thing and hadn't already turned them down. What would a Lynch cut even have looked like? Nobody will ever know, and that may be exactly why the image of him pulling away in that little white car has stuck around for 40 years. Number 3. The stars who said no. Almost every major role in the film came within a casting decision or two of going to someone else entirely. Tom Hanks, not yet a star, was considered for Brad, the older brother working his way down a ladder of humiliating fast food jobs. The part of Stacy circled a remarkable list of young actresses before it landed. Jodie Foster was a top choice, with Diane Lane, Brooke Shields, and Ellen Barkin all in the conversation. Even the surfer who would come to define the movie had other suitors. Matthew Broderick and Eric Stoltz both read for Spicoli. Stoltz didn't get him, though he turns up elsewhere in the picture in a smaller part. A respected character actor was offered the role of the strict history teacher and turned it down, put off by the script's coarser material. Each of those near misses sounds minor on its own. Put together, they meant the version of this cast that the world fell in love with was only ever one yes or no away from looking completely different. The roles ultimately went to near unknowns, several of whom would become far bigger than the established names who passed on them, a small irony in itself. Number 4. The real kids behind the roles. One of the movie's characters carries the name of a real classmate from Crowe's undercover year, a kid who would grow up to write some of the best-selling computer how-to books in America. Mark Ratner, the sweet and nervous rat, came from that corner of his reporting. So did Mike Damone, the fast-talking ticket scalper with an opinion on everything, and the history teacher who turns his classroom into a battlefield. Spicoli was different. On the page, Crowe didn't build him from one person, but from several surfers he'd watched drifting through Claremont, blended into a single character. And then there were the two young women at the heart of the story. Crowe based Stacy and Linda on teenagers he had known, and for more than 40 years, he has refused to say who they were, guarding their privacy long after the film made their fictional versions famous. That choice tells you something about how the material was handled. The comedy is broad, but the people underneath it were treated as people with lives that didn't end when the credits rolled. Who were the girls who became Stacy and Linda? Crowe has taken that answer with him, and it looks like he intends to keep it. Number 5. A first-timer took the director's chair. She had directed exactly one film of any length when Universal handed her a feature, and that one was a thesis short she'd made as a student at the American Film Institute. Amy Heckerling was 27, with no agent and no track record, and the studio gave her a raunchy teen comedy that several established men had already declined. She did not shoot the script she was handed. Heckerling went back to Crowe's novel, sat down with him, and rebuilt the thing from the source, pulling the shopping mall up into something close to a main character, the place where these kids worked and flirted and grew up under fluorescent light. A woman directing a studio sex comedy in 1982 was close to unheard of, and her presence shaped what the film paid attention to. It watched its girls as carefully as its boys, and it gave Stacy's storyline a tenderness the genre rarely bothered with. Heckerling has said she wanted the film to feel less like a structured comedy and more like life simply happening, the way American Graffiti had a decade before. That instinct made the movie what it is, and it would also put her on a collision course with a studio that had its own ideas about what this picture was for. Number 6. Nicolas Cage's hidden debut. Scan the credits of this 1982 comedy, and you'll find a name that wouldn't have meant much to audiences at the time. Nicholas Coppola. That was the legal name of a 17-year-old making his big screen debut a year after a single television pilot that went nowhere, and it belonged to the nephew of one of the most famous directors alive. He had reportedly tried to pass himself off as older to land a bigger part, until the producers worked out his real age and gave him something small instead. A background role with barely a line, one of Brad's friends, on screen briefly, and easy to miss. Being a Coppola on a film set in 1982 was not the advantage it might sound like. He was teased over the name and the family connection, and the whole experience seems to have stung. Almost immediately afterward, he picked a new surname and went out as Nicolas Cage, reportedly borrowing it from a comic book hero and an avant-garde composer. Anything that wasn't Coppola. The bit player nobody noticed in the mall scenes had begun one of the strangest, most committed careers in American movies, and he would build all of it without leaning on the family name. Number 7. The secret clean version. During the shoot, the crew filmed a second set of takes for several of the racier moments, softer versions designed for the day the movie would air on broadcast television. Networks in that era couldn't run the theatrical cut, so productions like this one shot around the problem in advance, capturing tamer alternatives while the sets were still standing and the actors were still in costume. Broadcast standards of the day were strict about language and skin, so a film this frank could never have aired the way it played in cinemas. The result is a sanitized parallel cut of the film that most fans have never sat through. Stranger still, that television version carries material the theatrical movie doesn't. A few moments and line readings that never reached cinemas at all. Alternate beats that exist only in the broadcast assembly. Decades later, it resurfaced as a bonus feature for collectors, a curiosity tucked beside the main attraction. How much of that shadow version is still sitting in a vault somewhere, a whole second take on a film people think they know by heart? Number 8. Sean Penn bombed his audition. I auditioned terribly and flat. That was Sean Penn's own verdict on the day he tried out for the role that would make him. By his account, he walked out of the room certain he'd blown it, and trudged into the parking lot toward a beat-up car. He had only one feature behind him, the Military Academy drama Taps, and little on his resume to suggest he could carry comedy at all. Then a casting director came after him. She told him, in so many words, to march back inside and audition like he meant it. Buoyed by someone finally believing in him, Penn went again, and this time something landed. The producers took a gamble on the sullen young actor who had just talked himself to the edge of losing the part. It's a strange origin for what became one of the most quoted comic performances of the decade. The man who would soon refuse to answer to any name but Spicoli very nearly didn't get through the door, and the difference came down to one person in that room deciding he was worth a second look. The producers, hardly convinced, were betting on instinct more than evidence. What he did with that second chance is its own story. Number 9. He never broke character. The checkerboard slip-on shoes, the sun-bleached hair, the permanent squint of someone who had just woken up at noon. Every visible piece of Jeff Spicoli was chosen with care, much of it by the young actor wearing them. Sean Penn turned up to play a stoned surfer and treated the assignment with the seriousness of a stage actor preparing a tragedy. He asked for his trailer to be labeled with the character's name instead of his own. He stayed in the part between takes, through lunch, across the entire shoot, so that the people working beside him never met the person hired for the job. They met Spicoli. Penn held the voice and the attitude so completely that there was nowhere to find a seam. That commitment paid off in moments the whole crew remembered. Crowe has described holding his breath, waiting for Penn to deliver one particular line to Ray Walston, the veteran actor playing the strict Mr. Hand. When Penn finally fired off the insult, fully in character and entirely unbothered, Walston was genuinely offended that a kid in his early 20s would speak to him that way. Behind the camera, Crowe and the others were trying not to laugh out loud because they could see exactly what they had. The friction was real, and it was perfect. Penn kept the disguise on right to the finish. According to his castmates, he only stepped out of Spicoli on the last day of filming, showing up in a black leather jacket to introduce himself as Sean for the first time. The crew had spent weeks with the character and were only now shaking hands with the actor. One of them, Scott Thompson, who played Arnold, put it simply, nobody got to know Sean because he was Spicoli the entire time. Number 10. The spin-off, almost no one saw. The movie became a touchstone for a whole generation. The television series it spawned barely registered. In 1986, 4 years after the film, the story came back as a sitcom that ran for only 7 episodes before vanishing, and most people who loved the original have never seen a frame of it. Almost the entire cast had moved on, so the show recast nearly everyone. Ray Walston returned as Mr. Hand, the history teacher, and Vincent Schiavelli came back as Mr. Vargas, the only other holdover from the original cast. But the famous young faces were gone. A then unknown Patrick Dempsey stepped into Damone, years before he became a household name, and the Stacy role went to an actress who would later anchor hit sitcoms of her own. The producers were apparently so anxious about sounding current that they hired a consultant whose entire job was to keep the teenage slang believable. 7 episodes later, the experiment was over, and the slang expert's services were no longer required. Stripped of the original cast chemistry and the film's frankness, the sitcom never found its footing, and it slipped off the air with almost nobody noticing. Number 11. She took a real pizza job to prepare. To find her way into Stacy, Jennifer Jason Leigh went and got hired at the mall. For about 3 weeks before filming, she worked shifts at the Perry's Pizza counter in the Sherman Oaks Galleria, the same kind of fast food spot where her character spends the movie, learning the rhythm of the register and the boredom and the regulars firsthand. She went inward as well as outward. Leigh dug out her own high school diaries and old letters and read back through them, mining her teenage self for the uncertainty and longing that Stacy carries through the story. It was a serious, almost method approach to a part the marketing would later treat as throwaway teen fare. That seriousness is all over the performance. Leigh gave Stacy a full interior life, the sense of a girl figuring things out in the moment and getting some of it painfully wrong, in a role the genre usually played for laughs. The waitressing shifts and the old diaries didn't show up on screen as trivia. They showed up as a character people believed. Number 12. The iconic song that's missing from the soundtrack. The piece of music most people hear in their heads when they think of this movie never appeared on its soundtrack album. Moving in Stereo, by The Cars, the hypnotic track scoring the film's most paused and parodied Daydream, was left off the official record entirely. So was the Go-Go's number that opens the picture, along with other tracks fans assumed they owned the moment they bought the LP. A Led Zeppelin track and a Tom Petty song heard in the picture went missing from it too, casualties of the same logic. The album existed as its own commercial product, assembled with its own logic about which artists belonged on it. Several of the songs that made the movie unforgettable sat outside that logic, and Heckerling had to fight to get certain tracks into the picture at all, pushing against a soundtrack operation that answered to interests well beyond the story she was telling, which raises a bigger question about who was actually steering the music on this film, and why a director kept having to argue for the songs in her own movie. That fight had a name attached to it, and it ran deeper than one missing track. Number 13. The prop that shocked the cast. On screen it plays as one of the biggest laughs in the movie. The fantasy sequence audiences have rewound more than almost any other scene of the era. Off-screen, the actor at the center of it found the day genuinely mortifying. Judge Reinhold has been candid for years that filming Brad's bathroom fantasy about Linda was, in his words, simulated but extremely personal and just humiliating to get through. Part of what makes his co-star's horrified reactions so convincing is that a good deal of it was real. Reinhold brought an unexpected element to the set that the rest of the cast hadn't been told about, and Phoebe Cates' look of shock when her character bursts in was not all acting. Crowe later confirmed the reaction was mostly unscripted. The scene almost always gets treated as a pure punchline, which skips past what it actually cost to make. A young actor agreed to put himself through something that left him feeling exposed and embarrassed, played it completely straight, and trusted that it would work. Heckerling helped by reframing the whole thing for him as a kind of love scene with himself, which broke the tension and got everyone laughing on the sidewalk between takes. The result is hilarious. It also cost the person performing it more than the laugh ever lets on. Number 14. Spicoli's dream TV cameo almost fell apart. Filling one small role should have been the easy part of the shoot. Instead, it turned into a comic chain of rejections all its own. The scene called for a recognizable television personality to appear as himself, interviewing the surfer on camera as though he were a champion, and one famous name after another said no. At least one camp reportedly balked at the content, uneasy about a bit built around a teenager celebrating his recreational habits a little too openly. Others simply passed. The fantasy that needed a celebrity kept coming up empty until the filmmakers found their answer closer to home. A working local sportscaster, a familiar face to viewers in the area, agreed to play himself interviewing Spicoli about his triumph in a surf contest. Each refusal chipped away at the reach for star power until a marquee name stopped being realistic at all. For audiences at the time, that worked better than a national star might have. The sportscaster carried the easy authority of someone people watched on the news every night, which made the daydream feel like it was being broadcast for real. A long run of rejections ended with exactly the right kind of yes. Number 15. Who really controlled the music? I was told that Irving Azoff soundtracks were driving the movies they were making at Universal. That is how Amy Heckerling later described arriving on the project, and it explains a great deal about the music in the finished film. Azoff was one of the most powerful managers in the business, with the Eagles and Stevie Nicks among his clients, and he co-produced the picture with one eye fixed on the album it would generate. By Heckerling's account, the songs largely came to her as a package. The producer Art Linson told her plainly that this was not a case where she could chase her own favorite tracks and slot them in. The movie was being driven by the artists already lined up for the soundtrack record. Roughly 19 songs made up that album, and the director's job was partly to find places for them. Heckerling has said the soundtracks of that era sometimes earned more than the films they came from, which tells you where the real leverage sat. None of that was unusual for the time. Studios and labels had figured out that a hit soundtrack could out-earn a modest movie, so the album often shaped the film as much as the other way around. On this picture, the arrangement gave the world a now classic collection of songs. It also meant a first-time director spent a good part of her debut negotiating for room inside her own movie. Number 16. The cut that dodged an X rating. The same few seconds of film that nearly slapped this comedy with the most restrictive rating the board could give are still in the movie today, just framed so you don't see what the censors objected to. The moment was the awkward, unhappy encounter between Stacy and Mike Damone in the pool house, and Amy Heckerling had shot it with deliberate symmetry. If the audience saw the young woman exposed, they would see the young man exposed too. Robert Romanus, who played Damone, performed the scene fully nude, matching what Jennifer Jason Leigh was being asked to do. Heckerling has said she was thinking of European films, which treated nudity as something that could cut both ways between the sexes. The Motion Picture Association did not see it the same way. She was warned that if the scene stayed as filmed, the movie would be released with an X, a rating that in 1982 was commercial poison and carried the stigma of adult content. When she pushed back, the explanation she got is the part she has never let go of. The board, by her account, told her the problem was specifically the male nudity. She remembers making the obvious objection that a woman shown the same way would have sailed through with an R, and getting an answer that left her nowhere to go. So the shot was reframed rather than thrown away, cropped to satisfy the board and earn the R the studio needed. Decades later, the Criterion Collection restored the original framing for its prestige home release, and even with the footage back in place, the film still carries an R, which only sharpened the point Heckerling had been making all along. As she put it, if it was a woman, it wouldn't be an X rating. Number 17. The scene you never got to see. Somewhere in the editing process, a small moment vanished that would have been the only time two of the film's most beloved characters ever crossed paths. In a record store, Mike Damone and Jeff Spicoli, the smooth talker and the surfer, ended up sharing the frame. The two of them improvised their way through the encounter, and then the whole thing was left out of the finished movie. Their storylines otherwise run on separate tracks, and that was by design. The film moves between its characters like a series of overlapping short stories, and the filmmakers kept most of them in their own lanes rather than forcing everyone into the same plot. The record store meeting, however good it might have been in the moment, broke that pattern, so it went to the cutting room floor along with whatever spark the two actors found there. What Survives is a movie where Damone and Spicoli orbit the same school and never quite collide, which is closer to how high school actually feels. Fans have wondered for years what the two might have said to each other, lines the actors found in the moment that nobody outside the edit bay ever got to keep. Number 18. The song that became an accidental smash hit. Number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100. That's how high a track written specifically for this teen comedy climbed, and it remains the biggest hit single Jackson Browne ever had. Somebody's Baby, recorded for the movie and playing under Stacey's tentative romance, outperformed everything else in a long and respected career. The closest a singer-songwriter of his stature ever came to a straightforward pop smash. It's a rare thing for a modestly budgeted film to throw off a chart hit like that. Rarer still given how the rest of the music fared commercially. The soundtrack album itself was a fairly quiet performer, peaking far down the chart. So the movie's lasting musical legacy ended up resting on a single song that broke out on its own. Browne got the defining hit of his career out of a film about California kids killing time at the mall, which is not where anyone would have gone looking for it. The album it came from told the opposite story, stalling near the bottom of the chart despite all the star power stacked across it. A single breakout song ended up carrying the film's whole musical reputation on its back. Number 19. The bold subplot for its time. This 1982 studio comedy handled one of its heaviest storylines with a calm that still feels surprising. After Stacey's brief involvement with Damone leaves her pregnant, the movie follows her through a difficult, very adult decision, without melodrama and without lecturing the audience about it. It refuses the big speech and the tidy moral, and shows a young woman handling something serious the way a real person might have to. Crowe has said this is one of the parts of the film he's proudest of, and he's acknowledged that the same scenes would draw far more heat if the movie were made today. Heckerling's approach was to play it straight, to shoot it, as she described it, the way it happens in life, rather than the way movies usually dress these moments up. A related beat was filmed and later trimmed out of some home video versions, which says something about how uneasy the material made people even after release. What stands out is the restraint. The subject could have been sensationalized or buried in melodrama, and instead it was handled with a plainness that respected both the character and the audience. That quiet honesty is a big part of why the film aged into something more durable than the genre it sat in. Number 20. Filmed in a mall after hours. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the shopping center sat dark and gated, its fountains off, while a film crew worked the empty corridors under the overhead lights. That was the nightly reality of this production. Because the location was a working business that couldn't close for a movie, the crew shot through the night, roughly 9 o'clock in the evening, until 9 o'clock the next morning, then cleared out before the first choppers arrived. The lighting alone could have blown the schedule. Rather than rig and balance new fixtures for every shot, the crew built custom lights designed to imitate the center's own fluorescent glow, so their footage would blend cleanly with the surrounding mall, and they wouldn't lose precious hours fighting the look of the place. They even redressed the whole location partway through the shoot, swapping back-to-school displays for Christmas decorations, as the story's calendar moved forward. It was an enormous amount of invisible work in service of something the audience would never consciously notice. The mall in the finished film feels effortless and lived in, which is exactly the point, and the only reason it does is that a crew spent night after night making a working shopping center pretend to be a movie set. Number 21. The rock star hiding in a car. The young woman who leans out and laughs at Brad as he stands mortified in the ridiculous pirate getup his fast food job forces on him is on screen for only a second or two. She also happens to be a real-life rock star. That's Nancy Wilson of Heart, who would later marry Cameron Crowe, tucked into the movie in a cameo so brief, most viewers have looked right past it for 40 years. Wilson was already a star in her own right, half of the sibling core that drove the band Heart, which makes a blink-long background gag an oddly humble place to find her. Her connection to the project ran deeper than the walk-on. Wilson wrote a track called Fast Times, intended for the film, but it never made it in, and it eventually found a home on one of her own band's records instead. So the future Mrs. Crow contributed both a hidden face and an orphan song to a movie her future husband had written, neither of which most fans ever realized was hers. It's the kind of small personal footnote that tends to hide in the margins of films built by people who went on to share their lives, the kind you only catch once you know to look for it. Number 22. The famous faces you missed. Plenty of people you'd recognize today are scattered through this movie in roles small enough to blink past. Eric Stoltz, who had read for Spicoli, turns up in a minor part. A young Forrest Whitaker plays the football star, and Anthony Edwards, years before his own fame, is in here too. The casting net was full of talent that hadn't broken yet. Some of the cameos are even sneakier. A future blockbuster director shows up in a bit role as a doctor, and a well-known comedian appears as the pizza delivery guy, both easy to miss if you aren't watching for them. There's a personal Easter egg buried in the production design as well. The band that plays the school dance was named after Heckerling's fiancée at the time, and his name even got spray-painted onto one of the set walls. A private little tribute hiding in plain sight on screen. The film is stuffed with these small signatures, rewards for anyone who knows where to look. Taken together, the movie plays almost like a yearbook of talent the industry hadn't caught up with yet. Half a dozen futures hiding in the background of a teen comedy. Number 23. The studio tried to bury it. For a while, the people who paid for this movie were the ones most desperate to make it go away. A test screening went badly, and an internal memo circulated at Universal that was bleak enough to put the film's entire future in doubt. One executive was reportedly so put off by it, especially by a certain bathroom fantasy scene, that he dismissed the whole thing as adult content and pushed to have it shelved. Instead of shelving it, the studio more or less dumped it. The movie went out to only a couple hundred theaters with barely any marketing behind it, the kind of release designed to cut losses rather than launch anything. By every signal coming from inside Universal, this was a write-off. Then audiences found it. Made for around $5 million, the film went on to earn many times that, turning into a sleeper hit on word of mouth that the studio's own marketing had done almost nothing to create. The picture its backers had been embarrassed by, the one an executive wanted gone, ended up among the most profitable things they released that year. Word of mouth did the work the marketing never attempted, filling seats the studio had never planned to sell. Number 24. A castmate moved in to save cash. Long before any of them were famous, the cast of this movie was mostly a bunch of broke young actors trying to make rent. The clearest example is what happened to Brian Backer, who played the shy, hopeless rat. He had flown across the country from Brooklyn to take the part and didn't have the money to cover a place to stay for the length of the shoot. So Jennifer Jason Leigh's family took him in, no questions asked. Backer moved into the Leigh household and stayed there, free of charge, until filming wrapped. Two of the young leads of a future cult classic were essentially roommates under a parent's roof, splitting a home because that was what the budget of their lives allowed. It's a small thing, but it captures how green and how close this group really was. They were kids in their early 20s figuring it out together, years away from trailers and handlers. A few of them only a couple of years from the kind of fame that would make sharing a family spare room unimaginable. Money was tight enough across the production that small arrangements like that were part of how the film got finished at all. Number 25. How it launched the teen movie era. By the middle of the 1980s, theaters were full of sharply observed comedies about high school. Films that took young audiences seriously as a subject rather than a backdrop for jokes. A surprising number of them traced back to one cheap 1982 release the industry had very nearly thrown in the trash. The turnaround started inside the same studio that had been embarrassed by it. Having watched a film they almost buried become a profitable hit, Universal and the wider business were forced to ask what they had gotten wrong, and why this scrappy comedy connected with young viewers when so much aimed at them did not. The answer pointed at exactly the things that had made executives nervous. The honesty, the willingness to treat teenagers as real people with real problems, the refusal to talk down to them. That lesson rippled outward. The wave of teen films that defined the rest of the decade, the John Hughes pictures and the movies that grew up alongside them like The Breakfast Club and Pretty in Pink, all drew from the template this one had drawn up first. It treated its characters with attention and respect, and it proved that approach could sell. The recognition eventually caught up with the reputation. In 2005, the Library of Congress added the film to the National Film Registry, the institution that preserves the country's most significant movies, a long way from a memo questioning whether it should be released at all. The teen comedy the studio had been ashamed of had become the blueprint everyone else borrowed from. Number 26. Penn met the real Spicoli, years later. Years after the movie, on a path running down to the beach, Sean Penn passed a man walking the other way with his wife and children. The stranger, articulate and warm, greeted him by name, then introduced himself. It took Penn a moment to place the face. This was the person his entire Spicoli had been built on. While Cameron Crowe had drawn the written character from several surfers he'd watched in San Diego, Penn's performance came mostly from one specific guy he had known growing up in Malibu. A real surfer whose voice and rhythm and easygoing strangeness Penn folded into the role. For decades, the two had not crossed paths. Now here he was on a trail, grown up, a family man, perfectly pleasant, with no idea that one of the most quoted comic characters in American film had been modeled on him. Penn has never said who he is. By his own account, he never told anyone the man's name, which means the inspiration for Spicoli almost certainly has no clue he is the inspiration for Spicoli. The icon belongs to everybody now, endlessly imitated and quoted. The real person it came from is still out there somewhere, walking down to the water, the only one who never got to be in on the joke. A cheaply made teen comedy that a studio tried to throw away ended up launching careers, minting a comic icon, and writing the rulebook for an entire genre. 40 years on, Fast Times at Ridgemont High has outlasted most of the films that were supposed to matter more than it did, preserved in the National Archive, and still pulling in viewers who weren't alive when it came out. Not bad for something one executive wanted shelved. If you found yourself rewinding any of these stories the way audiences once rewound a certain pool scene, do the thing that keeps this channel digging, the like and the subscribe, so the next deep dive finds its way to you. And before you go, settle a debate for the rest of us in the comments. Which of these secrets caught you completely off guard? Or which Spicoli moment still makes you laugh, no matter how many times you've seen it?